Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever.
When I was a teenager, society in America was at a crossroads. Something that had been viewed for centuries as ethically wrong was now quickly gaining widespread acceptance. Lawsuits, court cases surrounding this particular issue were popping up left and right, but it seemed that the more public the topic became, the more popular the behavior became as well. Eventually, you couldn't go to the movie theater, watch a TV show at home, or at times even just hang out with friends without being confronted with strong opinions regarding the pirating of music and movies. And it all seemed to get started around the year 2000 with a little peer-to-peer file sharing website called Napster. I remember the moment my friend first told me about this magical website where just about any song you could think of was freely available to download. Wait a minute, you're telling me that instead of paying $15 of my hard-earned money for a CD at Target, where I'm probably only gonna like 3, maybe 4 of the songs anyways, I could instead download an MP3 of those songs for free? It seemed too good to be true. But it wasn't. That was exactly what you could do. And as you might be able to imagine, though, musical artists, bands weren't quite as pumped on the whole idea. Why? Because they saw the free downloading of music, their music, that didn't belong to you and that you hadn't paid for as stealing. And the U.S. district courts viewed it in the same way as well, ruling in favor of musical artists like Metallica and Dr. Dre, who ended up suing Napster for copyright infringement upon other things. See, even though just about every society since the beginning of human history has had some sort of framework for viewing stealing as ethically wrong, in this particular instance, the moral line was moved, making the piracy of music and movies socially acceptable, especially in youth culture. So much so that most teenagers, including myself, didn't even think twice about it. And thus initiated the era of burned CDs and anti-piracy ad campaigns. Does anyone remember those anti-piracy ad campaigns? For you digital natives who were too young to remember or possibly not even born yet, let me share with you the annoyingly awful reality that is this anti-piracy commercial that myself and so many others were subjected to watch over and over and over again for years. Ooh, that is so bad, right? I mean, for like 3 years, that thing played before every movie you saw in theaters, as well as at the beginning of some DVDs, and at times you wouldn't even be able to skip past it. You were simply forced to watch it in order to get to your movie. It was awful. There's actually a study done recently that showed that these ad campaigns had an adverse effect. They actually caused people to want to download illegal content even more. Despite that reality, though, at some point while I was in college, I remember wrestling with the question of, is this right or is this wrong? And I wish I would have had the language back then like I do now of what does love require, because man, that would have been so helpful to me as a college student as I'm sorting through this. And even though I landed at the conclusion that, hey, it was wrong and it wasn't something I wanted to participate in anymore, I think if I had that lens of what does love require, I probably would have arrived at that same conclusion, but without so much judgment and condescension towards those who hadn't arrived at that place. But the point of the story is that right and wrong had been redefined along the lines of popular opinion. How did something that seems so straightforward quickly become so culturally acceptable? Well, that is one smaller example of what the Apostle John in this passage we're studying today would refer to as the world, or the influence of the world. It's the Greek word cosmos. And in the New Testament writings, there are a few different ways to define this one Greek word. Sometimes cosmos is defined as in the created world, right? Like how we define our English word cosmos. Other times it's defined as people or humanity, as in John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son. Both of these definitions of the world in those contexts are positive, not negative. In Genesis, we see that both the world, as in the physical cosmos, and humanity, they are good things that God created. So here, John's not saying, well, we shouldn't love the earth or we shouldn't love our fellow human beings. Although in my 3 decades of being in and around the church, I have seen and experienced these exact verses right here in 1 John chapter 2, 15 through 17 be weaponized by people as a reason to not show love or care to God's creation, or worse, as an excuse for not showing love to or even hating fellow human beings. But let me tell you, that is the furthest thing from John's intentions here. So what exactly does John mean by the term the world? Well, simply put, he's referring to the human system that is opposed to or hostile towards God. Theologian Dallas Willard defines the world as our cultural and social practices that are under the control of Satan and thus opposed to God. Cultural and social practices that are in opposition to God. In his book, Live No Lies, Pastor John Mark Comer defines the world as a system of ideas, values, morals, practices, and social norms that are integrated into the mainstream and eventually institutionalized in a culture corrupted by the twin sins of rebellion against God and the redefinition of good and evil. And by twin sins, Comer is referring back to the Garden of Eden, where the serpent's temptation in Genesis 3 to Adam and Eve, it essentially had 2 parts. The first part of the temptation was to distance them from God by causing them to believe the lie that God can't be trusted. Did God really say to not eat the fruit or you will die? Right? That little phrase planting the seed of distrust that God is not as good as he says he is, that God is holding out on you. You'll be better off doing your own thing apart from God. And the second part of the temptation in the garden was to redefine good and evil. You won't die. God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened. You will be like God, knowing good and evil for yourself. You won't need God to tell you what's good and what's bad. You'll be able to determine that for yourself based on the voices in your head and the desires of your heart. Comer would say that the world is when those 2 temptations, distance from God and the defining of good and evil for ourselves, are normalized. Cultural and social practices that are under the control of Satan and thus opposed to God. So with this definition of the world in mind, let's read our passage once again. John says in verse 15, "Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever." What John is pointing out here is that there is a way in which society views what it means to be human and how we should live out that human experience, which is in direct contrast with the way of Jesus and how he teaches us to live. When Jesus told his disciples in Mark 12 that the greatest commandment is to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and to love others as yourself, he was setting a standard of love that actually can't be pursued with the standard of the world guiding our beliefs and actions. John is saying it's impossible to love the world or the things of the world while simultaneously loving God. You can't do it because the world is in direct opposition of God. The world, and again, remember, he's not talking about people, but a fallen human system that is at work in society that tells us to live as if God is not who he says he is, and that good and evil are defined not by God, but by us, by humanity. And then the Apostle John, he takes this concept of the world even further by defining it in three specific ways that it plays out. Look back at verse 16. He says, "For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life comes not from the Father, but from the world." Now, in today's society, especially in like Christian church context, we normally associate the word lust with like sexual desire and really nothing else. And while that's a part of what John is referring to here, he's using the term much more broadly than that. Perhaps a better word for our understanding today might be the word craving, this strong craving or desire, the cravings of the flesh, the cravings of the eyes. Let's look back at that first one, the lust of the flesh. These are physical cravings. It could be for sex or food, alcohol, other substances. It could be a desire, cravings for attention, for beauty, for acceptance. These things aren't necessarily bad in and of themselves, but when we allow them to overtake or to become the focus, and now our desire for pleasure or instant gratification or even overindulgence or self-fulfillment, those things get in the way of our ability to love. That's when it becomes the lust of the flesh. Look at the second one, the lust of the eyes. Here, John is referring to whatever we look at, that we want for ourselves at the cost of our love for God and others. This could be greed, envy, jealousy. It could be materialism, or just that restless discontentment we feel in life so often, right? That desire for more things, more comfort, more status, more influence, more security, even when those things may be at the expense of someone else. The third is the pride of life. This is elevating ourselves above God and above other people. It's the autonomous, anti-authoritarian, and rebellious traits that are in all of us. That sinful bent to go our own way, to pursue our own power, our own control. Who are you to tell me what to do? Sometimes here in America, it gets masked as independence or personal rights. John's warning us that a fierce reliance and centeredness on self, it will lead us far astray and away from real love. Scholars point out that John here, he's pointing back to that well-known story of Adam and Eve and the garden temptation we see in Genesis 3. It's when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and also desirable for gaining wisdom. She took some and ate it. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Did you notice the parallels between Genesis 3 and 1 John 2? Right? The lust of the flesh, or It's good for food. The lust of the eyes, or it's pleasing to the eye. The pride of life, right? Or it's desirable for gaining wisdom. John is retelling the same old story because it's the human story. These three temptations are at the core of all temptations. And these are even the same three temptations that Jesus himself faced in the desert when he was being tempted by the devil. Read through the account in Matthew 4 this week. The lust of the flesh is turn these stones into bread. Right? The lust of the eye is when the devil says, bow down to me and I'll give you the kingdom of the world and all their splendor. The pride of life is when the devil tempts Jesus and says, hey, throw yourself down from the Temple Mount. Show us how powerful you are. What we read in Genesis 3 and in Matthew 4 or here in 1 John 2, it's the same old story because it's the human story. Right? The reality is we've all faced these same temptations. No, we weren't in the garden, but we've all experienced that moment 1,000 times. God says one thing and the voice in my head or the world around me says another. Part of me wants this and part of me wants that. And that temptation, it's usually one of the three, right? It's the lust of the flesh. Oh, there's just a part of my body that wants it, right? We just want to satisfy that craving, that longing, that desire. There are times when I turn to things that provide pleasure, that provide comfort because I want that instant gratification to try to silence or at least temporarily numb the insecurities or the anxieties that I feel. The lust of the eyes, when we see what others have or we notice what we don't have and that restlessness, it just takes over. Oh, if I could just have that thing, then I'd be happy. If I could just achieve this job or get that approval or have that relationship, establish this type of financial security, then I would be satisfied. For me, this plays out in the cycle of busyness and doing and striving for more and more because I'm so often tempted to believe the lie that achievement or the approval of others or the acclamation of things will satisfy. The pride of life. Don't tell me what to do. I know better. I want to maintain control. If I can just do what I want, if I can just be who I am, if I can just stay in control of my life, then I'll be okay. For me, I think this is the hardest one because it forces me to come face to face with that ancient temptation back in the garden. Do I actually trust that God knows what's best for me and that he wants what's best for me? Or am I convinced that it's better to just trust myself more? Because ultimately I know better than he does. The pull and the influence of the world, it's great. Because we've all experienced these things in one way or another. And as we've learned already in this series, perhaps the most predominant theme John focuses on in these letters is the theme of love. As Steve talked about in part 2, obedience to Jesus, obedience to his commands, it can all be summed up in that one word, love. This is exactly why John's language here surrounding the world, it's so strong because the temptations of the world, they distort our ability to love. When we live in the flesh, being driven by our sinful desires, we stop functioning like image bearers and we start acting like animals. Right? Animals on instinct, focused on meeting our needs for pleasure and survival first and foremost. When our lives are filled with envy and jealousy and comparison and the desire for more, we seek to have more than other people and even manipulate, possess, and control other people. When the pride of life is in our heart, we arrogantly attempt to dethrone God and live as the ruler of our own life. This is precisely why John says we can't love the world while also loving God. They stand in opposition of one another. So then the question is, how do we overcome the world? How do we overcome the influence, the pull of the world? Well, John gets to that just a few chapters later. In 1 John chapter 5, he says this in verse 4, "For everyone born of God overcomes the world. This is the victory that has overcome the world, even our faith." Who is it that overcomes the world? Only the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God. What is it that gives us the ability to overcome the world? John says it's our faith in Jesus instead of our faith in the world. What gives us the ability to overcome the world is our belief that Jesus is who he says he is. I think sometimes we limit or we minimize believing in Jesus to simply mean believing that he is God in human form who came to earth, died on the cross for our sins, and rose from the grave so we can have eternal life. Which all of that is true. And all of that is an essential part of believing in Jesus. But believing in Jesus is not just a theological stance. Believing in Jesus is a practical way of living. Believing in Jesus, it's an alternative way of life that actually stands in stark contrast to the way of the world. Jesus' vision of a flourishing life, it's often 180 degrees apart from the moral norms of our day. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, do I actually believe that Jesus is all he says he is? Not just when it comes to the cross and the empty tomb, but when it comes to how I'm supposed to live my everyday life. Do I actually believe that Jesus isn't just the Son of God, but that he is also a truth teller? That he is a trustworthy source of loving wisdom? That I can and should fully and radically reorient my life around him? That I should live compelled by his words and his actions in all that I do? Do I actually believe that what Jesus says about what it means to be human, about our purpose in life, about how we are to live in relation to God or to ourselves, to one another, about how we're to handle money and possessions, about our relationship to power and security and comfort, about how we are to approach our bodies and our sexuality, about how we are to navigate our marriage or our singleness, about how we are to care for and serve the outsider and the marginalized? Do I actually believe that what Jesus says about these things is true? Even when, especially when, it stands in stark contrast to the way of the world. Do you believe? Until we believe that Jesus tells a better story than the ones the world has led us to believe, we will never stand a chance of overcoming the world. Let me say that again. Until we believe that Jesus tells a better story than the ones the world has led us to believe, we will never stand a chance of overcoming the world. Who is it that overcomes the world? Only the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God. So what is overcoming the world? What does that look like practically in daily life? Well, there's two things I want to point to. The first thing is resisting. Overcoming the world means that we actively resist the ways in which the world tries to define what it means to be human or how we are to live life. Resisting those lies that stand in contrast to the way of Jesus. In Romans 12, the Apostle Paul says, do not conform to the pattern of the world. He's saying the default setting for our fallen, sinful self is to comply with or to abide by the pattern of the world. If you're not intentional, you're going to conform to that pattern. That's just what happens. So instead, we have to actively pursue counterformation to the pattern of Jesus. Paul says this happens by being transformed through the renewing of your mind. This is why it's so important for every follower of Jesus to constantly ask themselves the question, what are the lies of the world that I've found myself believing instead of the truth of Jesus? In what ways have I been assimilated into the culture of the world? We have to name them. How can we resist what we don't know? But here's perhaps the most important thing when it comes to this idea of resisting. Do you know that it's much easier to spot the world in another person than it is to spot the world in myself? It's so much easier to notice the ways others are conforming to the pattern of this world than it is to identify the ways in which my own heart is bent, sinfully bent, and drastically needs transformation. Church, resist the temptation to make this about others. Resist the temptation to make this about others. Resist the temptation to make this about others. We have to look inward. Overcoming the world, it looks like resisting, but it also looks like illuminating. In his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus makes our mission as his followers to the world around us very clear when he says, "You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden." He says, "In the same way, let your light shine before others that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." You see, our mission as Jesus followers, when it comes to how we interact with the world, our mission is not escapism. This isn't a let's circle the wagons, let's buy a commune and all hide away from the big, bad, evil world. Let's move to another state that is less worldly and avoid it and protect. But also, our mission as Jesus followers is not to fight for power or for control of the world. We aren't called to establish Christian dominance over the world or to seek to enforce our values upon society. No, Jesus says our mission to the world is to be light. Light that illuminates the darkness around us. Light that only comes from the true source of light, from Jesus himself. Overcoming the world is about recognizing the world for what it is. It's a fallen human system that stands in opposition to the way of Jesus. But then allowing the truth of who Jesus is to reign in our lives and allowing his love to shine through us and illuminate the dark world around us. You see, the church's call is to be a community of people who are becoming more and more like Jesus, who are increasingly transforming day by day into greater Christ-likeness, and as a result, are creating a different culture and alternative society than the way of the world. Not removed from the world, not overpowering the world, but right in the midst of the mess and the brokenness, providing hope and an alternative way. You see, remember what the Apostle John's already taught us through this series, right? The defining characteristic of the way of Jesus, that primary evidence that we're being obedient to Jesus' commands, the biggest identifying factor that we're being formed into a community that provides this different way of living than the way of the world, that primary identifying factor is our love. That's our mission. That's our call. And so that's my prayer for us and for this church, that we may overcome the world through our belief in Jesus Christ, that he really is who he says he is, and then that reality transforms us through his love so we can show his love to the world around us. I want to close by reading Jesus' words from the Sermon on the Mount, found in Matthew 5, 14 through 16, but I want to read it from the Message translation. And I don't want to just read it, I want to speak it as a prayer over us, as Cornerstone Fellowship, as this community of people who are seeking to follow Jesus together and live out this mission to the world around us. Let's pray. You are here to be light, bringing out the God colors in our world. God is not a secret to be kept. We're going public with this, as public as a city on a hill. If I make you light bearers, you don't think I'm going to hide you under a bucket, do you? I'm putting you on a light stand. Now that I've put you there on a hilltop, on a light stand, shine. Keep open house. Be generous with your lives. By opening up to others, you'll prompt people to open up with God, this generous Father in heaven. Amen.
Wait, before you go, 3 things. First, please consider becoming one of Cornerstone Fellowship's financial partners. Your donations will ensure that you'll be able to continue enjoying helpful and hopefully life-changing messages like the one you just watched. And number 2, please share the link to this message with anyone who you know needs it or will be blessed by it, or post the link to your own personal social platforms. And finally, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you'll be alerted whenever we post more content. Thanks for watching.